Steamboat was a black stallion, born around 1901 near Chugwater, known on the rodeo circuit for his strength in throwing off riders. In 1909, his silhouette was adopted as the state's official emblem. Since 1936, it has appeared on Wyoming license plates, evoking the heritage of local cowboys. Early 1870s ethnographic accounts record that in the Uinta Ute camps, dogs were not limited to mere companionship. They pulled small travois, guarded provisions, helped in hunts, and took part in ceremonies, forming a structural part of the group's economy and ritual life. Photo of the last known gathering of the survivors of the confrontation, fought on June 25, 1876, held on June 25, 1948, at what was then the Custer Battlefield National Monument, Crow Agency, Montana. Lakota, Cheyenne veterans, and former Army Scouts reenact for the camera the outcome that sealed the defeat of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Calamity Jane, born Martha Jane Canary, registered in Deadwood, Dakota Territory around 1876, at a time when she served as an Army courier and civilian guide on the route to the Black Hills goldfields, a few months after the murder of Wild Bill Hickok, her saloon and traveling partner. Final record of William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, taken in Denver at his sister Mary Decker's house on January 7, 1917. He still wears a hat and a suede jacket, trademarks of the Wild West shows that spread the frontier myth. The image comes right before his death on January 10th from kidney failure and ends his public presence. In 1885, Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota leader, had already left exile in Canada and surrendered to the United States Army. Held as a prisoner at Fort Randall, he was later transferred to the Standing Rock Reservation. That same year, he agreed to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, receiving a regular salary to travel through American cities and perform for audiences interested in the recent Indian Wars. A photograph from 1887, taken in the Montana Territory, shows 7 Crow Nation chiefs lined up in front of a modest wooden building next to the Indian Agency post. The image documents the diplomatic presence of these leaders during negotiations with federal representatives in the period of transition to reservations. A 1900 image shows a member of the Western Apache Nation, photographed in White River, in what is now the Fort Apache Reservation in eastern Arizona. The image is part of efforts by ethnographers and federal agents at the turn of the 20th century to document indigenous populations under the new reservation policies instituted by the United States government. In 1925, Wyatt Earp, the famous former sheriff of Tombstone and central figure in the OK Corral gunfight, was photographed by the Colorado River facing Arizona. The snapshot, taken during a visit to old mining areas in the Southwest, shows the Old West veteran reminiscing about the frontier he helped pacify decades earlier. Millie Ringgold, born enslaved in the American South, migrated to Yogo Creek, Montana shortly after emancipation, drawn by the 1879 gold rush. She worked as an independent prospector and, with her earnings, opened a boarding house that welcomed black miners and travelers, a rare example of African-American female-owned property on the frontier. A 1912 image shows a dying Navajo woman with 2 small children and a dog at a camp near Winslow in northern Arizona. The photo captures the pastoral daily life of Navajo families on the eve of the railroad's completion, which would expand the wool and craft trade after the 48th American state was established. A studio portrait taken around 1897 depicting Jimmy Sequent, a representative of the Northern Shoshone, during a visit to Pocatello, Idaho. The photograph, produced in a typical commercial setting on the railroad frontier, captures a time when indigenous leaders sought to assert identity and negotiate rights amid federal pressures after the Plains Wars. A photo taken by Edward S. Curtis in Montana around 1900 shows Cheyenne participants prepared for the Sundance, the annual ceremony celebrating cosmic renewal and tribal unity. The image was captured when federal policies pressured indigenous nations to abandon traditional rights, making this shot a rare visual testimony of Cheyenne cultural resistance. A hand-colored photo portraying Bone Necklace, an Oglala Lakota chief taken around 1899, possibly in F.A. Reinhardt's studio during the Trans-Mississippi Exposition. The scene dates to the time when the Lakota Nation was confined to reservations, and federal assimilation laws forced their transition from buffalo hunters to dependence on government subsidies. Eureka, Colorado, around 1900. In the Animas River Valley, the small mining camp appears among the San Juan Cliffs, with wooden shacks, ore piles, and the narrow-gauge Denver and Rio Grande line that brought supplies and carried out silver and zinc. After the Panic of 1893, only a few dozen residents remained, but the chimneys still smoked, proof of ongoing work despite the winter isolation. Boss Caswell's Monkey Saloon, a gathering spot for miners and railroad workers in Granite, Colorado, on the banks of the Arkansas River in the early 1880s. The establishment, humorously named, reflected the local gold camp culture and served as a center for information, commerce, and leisure during a time of rapid change in the region. Chung On, a Chinese merchant settled in Virginia City, Montana, around 1896. His store provided dried foods, teas, and silks to the miners who stayed on after the gold boom. The image shows the role of the Chinese community, established there since the 1860s, in supplying the frontier and maintaining ties with the Pacific, despite the anti-Chinese legal barriers in effect. An 1889 photograph shows prospector Archie Smith on the porch of his cabin near Eagle Creek, on the outskirts of Murray, Idaho. The snapshot marks the decline of the local gold rush, when small independent miners lacking heavy machinery persisted in extracting gold-bearing gravel to keep the settlement that had emerged early in the decade alive. James Butler Wild Bill Hickok appears in Springfield, Missouri in 1864, at the height of the Civil War. He was then serving as a civilian scout for the Union Army, moving between camps to gather information about Confederate guerrillas harassing the Missouri-Kansas border. The city, a strategic point on supply routes, was under military occupation and in a constant state of tension. Photo of the first house built on the spot where Dodge City, Kansas stands today. The simple ranch was raised in August 1872, right after the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad reached the area. It served as a rest stop for buffalo hunters and traders traveling the old Santa Fe Trail, the initial mark of the settlement that, months later, would become known for livestock and Old West caravans. Death Valley. In the 1870s, after the discovery of borax in the dried Furnace Creek beds, mining companies formed convoys of 2 10-ton wagons, driven by a driver and an assistant, pulled by 20 mules and sometimes 2 horses. The nearly 270-kilometer trip to the Mojave Rail Junction, under extreme heat, brought the ore into the Pacific industrial networks and popularized the legendary 20-mule team. A camp wagon known as a chuck wagon, parked at the edge of a rodeo arena in Texas around 1900. This basic vehicle for the long cattle drives of the post-Civil War era served as a traveling kitchen and support point for cowboys, illustrating the shift from ranch work to the public spectacle of early 20th century rodeos. Around 1876 in Ford County, Kansas, Bartholomew Bat Masterson, 23, and Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp, 28, posed shortly after being appointed deputy sheriffs. Their patrols in Dodge City, then the endpoint of the Texas Cattle Trail, symbolized the effort to enforce the law on a frontier marked by clashes among cowboys, buffalo hunters, and freight haulers. In 1908, 2 Apsaluk riders, called Crow by the colonizers, pose in front of their tipi, set up among snow-covered conifers on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains in Montana. The photograph, taken during the reservation era, shows the persistence of winter nomadic ways of life, despite federal sedentarization policies and the assimilation efforts imposed by the United States government. A photo of Wyatt Earp, taken in 1923 when the former sheriff, then 75, lived in Los Angeles and advised movie studios on the first Old West scripts. Already a national legend for the 1881 shootout at the OK Corral, he was then trying to ensure that the story preserved his reputation and brought him profit at a time when the pioneer frontier had become a memory. A 1914 photo shows two Navajo men on horseback, in the shadow of Shiprock, a sacred formation for the Dine and a landmark in northwestern New Mexico. The scene reflects the daily herding and traveling within the reservation after the federal policies of 1868. An image of the veteran Rocky Mountains explorer Jim Bridger, taken around 1876, when the famed hunter and guide was living his final years. The photo shows one of the last mountain men, a generation that, from 1820 to 1840, opened trade routes, described passages like the South Pass, and served as a link among fur trappers, the military, and various indigenous nations of the American West. An 1887 scene, a cowboy sitting in front of the wooden facade of the BT Ranch in Missouri. In the final phase of the cattle boom, ranches like this served as stops for Texas herds arriving by rail. His brake, hat tipped down and boots covered in dust, reflects the fatigue of large cattle drives, just before fences and farms reshaped the plains. Interior of a saloon in Prescott, Arizona, c. 1900. Men in hats gather around the long bar and pine tables while a pianist improvises ragtime. These bars worked as social centers for the mining town, serving cowboys, prospectors, and travelers in a region that would soon leave territorial status to become a state in 1912. Men gathered in a tavern in Southern California around 1890. On the table, glasses of craft beer and playing cards go around, a common pastime for railroad workers and farmers who, after the gold rush boom ended, began meeting in these wooden establishments to discuss orange prices, local politics, and news of the new Southern Pacific branch. A studio photograph of an unknown Ute individual, produced in Denver, Colorado in 1870, when photographers in the American West sought to document indigenous leaders for ethnographic albums and to satisfy the growing interest of the urban public during the railroad expansion.